Hi, my name is Joshua Fries, and I'm doing my presentation today on pinworms. As you can see, there's a picture over here that shows what pinworms look like and their approximate size. So pinworms are also known as Enterobius formicularis, and these are small, thin, white roundworms, as you saw on the previous slide. They're most common in children, which is anyone under 18, and they're the most common worm infection currently in the United States. And humans are considered the only host for this parasite. They reproduce sexually, with a male and a female pinworm reproducing in the intestine of a human. And they're easily treatable through over-the-counter drugs that are very accessible, and they can be prevented by washing your hands. So as you can see, picture of a child washing your hands, because children touching the something that is dirty, like a toy or something else, is the most common way that they get infected with pinworms. So this is a global map showing roundworm infections. So roundworms are just the type of family that pinworms fall underneath. And as you can see, roundworm infections are most prevalent in developing countries. So over here in Africa, you see the highest prevalence of roundworms, and among roundworms, pinworms are one of the highest causes of infection. And they're most common in developing countries because of what we talked about previously when it came to how to prevent these infections, which is washing your hands and other hygiene prevention aspects. And these countries typically don't have access to clean water or the materials to keep themselves properly, to have proper hygiene. So the life cycle of pinworms is first, the transmission occurs either through direct or indirect causes. The direct cause being the example I gave earlier of a child touching something dirty like a toy, or a sandbox being a common form of infection, where pinworm eggs are in there from another child's fecal material, and them not properly washing their hands, and then them touching their mouth. And the other form is through an indirect transmission, which would be having an open wound and the eggs getting in that way. Pinworms can also commonly, you can commonly reinfect yourself when you have this infection. So this can happen via the life cycle proceeding throughout you, and then you itching your anal region and not washing your hands, and then retouching your mouth. And the whole process of the eggs being ingested by you is happening all over again. So typically when the eggs get in your system, they move throughout the body into the intestine, and this is when the male and the female pinworms are released. So as you can see in step 3, shows the larval hatch in the small intestine, and then the adults move to the lumen of the cecum, as seen in step 4, and this is where they mate with each other, and then the female gets pregnant with the eggs. The male typically dies after they go through the reproduction, and then the female moves towards the rectum, and in the process of moving towards the rectum goes through all the processes of the intestine. And then here the female either dies and the eggs burst out, or it starts to crawl out the anus and lay eggs all around the anal region. And that's how the typical life cycle of the pinworms happens. So some symptoms and treatments of pinworms. Itching of the anal region is the most common symptom, and insomnia and abdominal pain being another one, just from the hatching of the eggs in the abdominal region, and insomnia from being in itching and pain throughout the night and not really being able to get a good night's sleep. And one interesting fact about pinworms, it's not really known whether or not it's a symptom or not yet, but it's considered that pinworms might be a cause of appendicitis. So with the appendix being on their track to the rectum where the female lays the eggs, a lot of researchers have looked into this for the past 30 years, and there's a lot of different research some stating that it does cause appendicitis, some stating that it doesn't. It's currently still inconclusive, but it's just an interesting side note about pinworms. And some ways to treat them are over-the-counter drugs. So a common one that I have a picture of over here is mebendazole. This can be bought over the counter, and it's typically required that you take 2 doses. So 1 dose when you realize that you have the pinworm infection, which kills the adult pinworms, and then a second dose about 2 weeks later to try and prevent yourself from getting pinworms again. And this is because of what I stated about the really common way of people reinfecting themselves. So the second dose is in case you reinfected yourselves and you have more adults in you to kill them, because the drugs that we have to treat pinworms don't kill the eggs, they only kill the adults. And then an interesting paper that I found about pinworms has to do with immunocompromised patients. This paper specifically looking at tuberculosis patients being susceptible to intestinal parasites. And in this paper, they specifically looked at roundworms, and pinworms were among those roundworms that they looked at. And they came to the conclusion that about 48% of the TB patients that they saw had a roundworm infection, and this is higher than the amount of non-TB patients in that same region. And this was statistically significantly higher. And why this is important is because when you're immunocompromised, even something like pinworms, which isn't seen to cause serious illness, can add to you getting other serious infections. So since the most common symptom that pinworms cause is itching of the anal region, this can lead to inflammation of the tissue, and the inflammation of the tissue can be a common breeding ground for more bacteria to go there and then infect the immunocompromised patient more. And this is also important to consider because when we looked at the worldwide map of pinworm infections earlier, you saw that it was mainly in developing countries, specifically Africa, where TB is very present, but where also things like HIV are very present, which makes you immunocompromised as well. So having multiple things that make you immunocompromised in the same region where you're seeing a high rate of intestinal parasite infections is going to lead to these people having worse outcomes and worse symptoms, and possibly be one of the reasons that they lead to death because of what I stated with being a breeding ground for for more infections. And this is just one of the ways that pinworms can be a more serious infection than most people realize that it is. And then here are some works cited on where I got my information. And I hope you enjoyed my presentation on pinworms. Thank you.